Welcome to the show, everyone. I am so excited about today's topic because I have wanted to address this for so long. And let me tell you about my powers of manifestation. So it's been in my head even more recently. And then as of the recording of this episode this week, I was interviewed on a show called The Upside of Bipolar by Michelle Reitinger. And we had such a great conversation. And I was so relieved and refreshed to sort of feel like, okay, like we're on the same page about this, and she's had a diagnosis and she helps people with diagnosis, and I have sort of the judgment about the whole diagnosis. And so that kind of gave me permission to be like, oh my God, can we have a conversation on my show about this? So I've invited Michelle back, and well, I've invited Michelle to the show, and you're going to hear both of us have two conversations. One, me interviewing her here, and then I will also be publishing the one that she put on her podcast as well. So if you're here on YouTube, hi, I'm JJ. If you're looking for Michelle, just know this is my show, which means I'm going to talk too. So if you don't love me, which is totally cool, Michelle, where can they find more of just you?
The Upside of Bipolar.com is my website, and all of my handles on social media are the Upside of Bipolar. On X, it's actually Upside of Bipolar, but yeah, so that's where you can find me.
Well, welcome to the show, Michelle.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to talk today.
Me too. I was so revved by our conversation because, like I said to you after we stopped recording, to be perfectly honest, I get because of a core wound and because of the programming that I've had from people around me who are, and I don't mean this to sound I don't know, whatever it's going to sound. Just know that I'm aware that there other people are going to take this in a different way. When people feel threatened by the information that you have, because it means they may have to change their behavior or be responsible for their behavior, they don't like that. So then they tell you that what you know, you're not qualified to say that. You're not a therapist. You're not a degree doctor, blah, blah, blah. I don't need to listen to you. Right. And I've heard that forever in both professions because as a personal trainer who was around doctors all the time and in this field and just I know shit. So I mean, anyway, people would say, well, you're not a doctor. That's like the way to go. I don't want to listen to you because I don't want to make any changes about what I want to do in the case that you're right. So my programming has been that just, tread lightly, JJ. You're not a therapist. Tread lightly, JJ. And here I am coming onto your show and I'm treading lightly, even though I will tell you that I had someone last year who did my Awaken Your Dream Life program who is a therapist. And when she came into the group, now she paid to be there. When I heard what she did, she said, I have to tell you, you've changed everything about the way that I do my practice. And I was like, holy cow, if that's not the best compliment ever with all the things that I'm doing. And so, but it's still, people want that degree. They want to see that somebody has deemed you available to say this, and we are backed by this university who's backed by the pharmaceutical companies, right? Like that's what they want to hear. So I appreciated our conversation because it made me really ready to have this. And I'm so happy to have you here because it'll be so much more fun to have it with you and to hear your side of someone who's gone through stuff like this. So I want you to tell people your story as detailed or as far back as you want to go, or as, sound bite as you want to go about before being diagnosed and then just bring us to today.
Absolutely. So I'm super thrilled to talk to you. It's really funny because the way that you talk about your experience sharing what you know with people, I had that same experience when I was first, trying to share with people what I'd learned because we are so conditioned in our society to believe that only people who really know what they're talking about are the ones with the letters behind their name. And I'm not dismissing the education, the experience that they have, but we have got to change the way that we view and understand expertise because it's not just about the university education. I have done a ton of education. I was desperate. And when I was first diagnosed, so I was diagnosed back in 1998, 2 months before I graduated from college. And leading up to that, the 2 years leading up to that, I had been experiencing increasingly severe mood swings. I was in college and I would go for, weeks being really elevated in my mood. I'd have big ideas. I'd have a big new life plan. And I was sure that this was it. This was what I was going to do for the rest of my life. This was what I was meant to do. And I'd tell everybody about it. And then I would crash and get depressed. And I would have a few weeks of severe depression, watching excessive amounts of television. And then I would start to get elevated in my mood again. And the next time I got elevated, I'd have a whole new life plan. I changed my major 6 times in one semester. And my parents started to become really concerned. They lived in a different state. And what they were seeing was during those periods of elevated mood, I would call them regularly and speaking really animatedly and really excited about, all of the things that I was going to do with my life. And then they wouldn't hear from me for a couple of weeks. And then the next time they heard from me, I had a completely different plan and a completely different focus. And I was sure this was the right thing. And then they wouldn't hear from me for a couple of weeks. And it was like this, and it was getting more intense. And so they finally convinced me to go see a doctor. And I was very nervous about seeing a doctor. I knew there was something wrong. I could tell, I could feel the instability in myself. But I was really afraid of going and being told I was broken, and when I went into the doctor, I was severely depressed the day that I went in for my appointment, and my aunt came with me. And so she provided a lot of the information because I couldn't think straight. I was having a hard time articulating what was going on. And I was initially diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorders, and they put me on an antidepressant. And within a few months, I became manic. And so then they said, "Oh, we, accidentally diagnosed you with the wrong thing. We actually recognize now that you have bipolar 2 with rapid cycling." And I didn't have any reason to believe otherwise. Like it made sense. What they told me made sense. They said I had a chemical imbalance, that my brain chemistry was out of whack, and that it was like having diabetes and the medication was like insulin. And that made a lot of sense to me. And so I was so relieved to be given an explanation. And so I started taking the drugs, and I did everything the doctors told me for 10 years, and I just kept getting worse. And it got especially bad when I started having children. I had my first two babies, and each time I would have really severe postpartum depression coupled with a postpartum hyperthyroid condition. And most people know about hypothyroid, where your thyroid is not, working the way that it's supposed to, and people gain weight. And I was having the opposite. I was losing an excessive amount of weight. I was about 25 pounds under my lowest weight. I looked anorexic. My mom thought I had an eating disorder. I was eating like crazy. I was passing out. I was losing excessive amounts of hair. Like I was just really sick. And I didn't know what to do. My life felt out of control. And I was struggling with severe, even though I was taking all the drugs they told me to take, I was still struggling with really severe mood swings. And I started to develop suicidal ideation. It started with nightmares. Everybody's different, so that everybody's experience is not going to be the same as mine. But mine started with nightmares. I was having really, really vivid nightmares about dying, and I would wake up feeling really sick inside and afraid. And then it kind of developed into daydreams. So I would be like driving down the road, and my brain would present scenarios where I could die and people would think it was an accident. And at first I was horrified by this. And I didn't want anybody to know. I'm like, they're going to think I'm crazy. They're going to put me in the hospital. So I didn't tell anybody. But then I started to find relief in the idea of dying because I was suffering so much. I had two little children. I was sure I was ruining their lives. My stepson, I was sure I was ruining his life. I knew my husband would be better off if he could find a different wife for himself and a different mother for my children. And I just didn't want the suffering to go on. I was suffering so much. Everybody was suffering. And I had a breakdown finally in 2008. I was so severely depressed that I knew that if I didn't get some help, I was going to do something desperate to myself or my family. And I was put in the hospital, the first of 3 hospitalizations over a 2-month period. They did electroconvulsive therapy on me, which some people call shock treatment. And I had my first full-blown psychotic episode, which changed my diagnosis from bipolar, 2 to bipolar 1. And I made multiple attempts on my life. And at that point, I just felt like there was no hope. It didn't feel like, and the doctors were telling me like, this is a chronic condition. You're going to have it for the rest of your life. And I'm like, I don't want to live anymore then. Like, I don't want to live like this. There's no hope. I don't want to ruin my family's lives. I don't want to keep suffering. But then I had an experience that changed everything for me. I was watching my children play one day. It was after my 3rd hospitalization. I'd been out for a few weeks. And I was watching them play one day, and I had a really clear, lucid thought, probably the first one in years, that if I ever successfully ended my life, that I would ruin my daughter's life. She was 4 years old, and I knew in that moment that if I ever succeeded in ending my life, it would ruin her. She'd believe it was her fault, and it would ruin her life. And I was horrified at the thought of that because I thought I was doing them a favor by trying to end my life. I thought that it was going to be better for them. They'd be better off. But I knew it was true. She was always trying to make everybody feel better, and I knew she would think it was her fault. From that moment on, I committed myself to survive for her. And I thought the best I could ever expect out of life was just learning how to suffer well, but I was willing to do it for my daughter because I knew her life had value. Even though I didn't believe mine did, I knew hers did. And so from that point on, I started to try and figure out how to help myself. I didn't know any better than what the doctors were telling me. I was doing everything they told me to do and nothing was working. But I started to develop the first tool that was my first step. I didn't know it at the time, but it was the first step on the way to healing. And it was called the Mood Cycle Survival Guide. It's a free resource I offer to people on my website, but I started learning how to be more proactive about managing my symptoms. I knew they were coming. Up to that point, it always felt like whenever I would experience mania or depression, it felt like getting yanked onto a roller coaster, and I was just holding on white knuckled, waiting to the end of the ride to survey the damage that I'd done during the process. And I thought, okay, if I know it's coming, I've got to figure out a way to do something about it. And so I learned how, over time, figured out how to proactively manage those symptoms, how to anticipate when things were going to happen, what to do when they did happen, who were my team, who were the people that could help me. And as I developed that plan for myself, I started to have more control. I started to be able to take more responsibility for myself, and it started to help me not feel like a victim to what was happening to me. And then gradually over time, I started discovering more tools and resources to help me actually heal. And I have to tell you, during the next 10 years, as I was going through the healing process, I didn't know I was healing because I believed what I'd been told by the doctors. And I went back and counted, I've had at least 8 doctors over the time that from the time I was diagnosed because of moves and hospitalizations and everything. Every single one of them validated the diagnosis. Every single one of them would tell me these are chronic conditions. You'll have it for the rest of your life. You'll always need medication. I have been off medication since 2010. I do not experience these symptoms anymore. And at first, when I first started back at the end of 2020 was when I started trying to share what I was learning. And at that time, I still believed I had bipolar. And I still believed I would have it for the rest of my life because I didn't know to question what I'd been told. But as I started doing more research, I started reading a ton, reading a bunch of books about the resources and tools that I was using because I wanted to teach other people. And I thought I need to know more about this if I'm going to teach somebody else about it. As I started reading all of this stuff, I started finding the studies that had been done on all these things. Micronutrient insufficiency is a big underlying source of symptoms. People who struggle with unhealed trauma, unprocessed, unhealthy thought and behavior patterns, unhealthy coping mechanisms, all of these things will produce these symptoms that are then diagnosed as bipolar disorder, and people think they've been given an explanation. When somebody is diagnosed with bipolar disorder or major depressive disorder or anxiety disorder or ADHD, they think that they have been given an explanation for what's going on, and they have not. All that has been identified are the symptoms. It's like somebody going to the doctor if they've been running fevers consistently and the doctor says you have fever disorder. That's what we're doing with these diagnoses. All we're doing is describing the symptoms.
Right. That's amazing. I didn't know your story, and I had listened to parts of your show before we met, but I didn't listen to, obviously this wasn't as compact in that because you're interviewing other people like me. Okay, so since the last time we talked, I had asked you at the end of our interview what your sign was, and you said that you were a Taurus, but you didn't know anything else. So I'm just can I do a little chart reading for you?
Absolutely.
Okay. Your moon's in Scorpio. So let me explain what that is really quick. So Scorpio is a water sign. It's the middle water sign. So if I had to quickly do an overview of astrology, you often see it as a wheel because it's like a calendar, but honestly, it's a start and a finish. So we have Aries is first, Pisces is last. There are 3 sections, and each section has 4 elements: fire, earth, air, and water. And that repeats: fire, earth, air, water, fire, earth, air. Okay. And imagine a snowball. And Aries is the infant of the signs. Aries comes in and they're literally brand new. Like they've got very not that much to process. Like they don't, it's like right, wrong, black, white, yes, no, simple, and they get overwhelmed easily sometimes depending on, because again, they're the infant of the signs. There's a lot of positive. That's not a negative. But then every sign evolves like a snowball and has the positive and the negatives of everyone before it. And then we get to Pisces at the end, which has everybody's good stuff and everybody's bad stuff. Now that's just a very general overview. So I look at it in stages. So you have your Taurus, which is you're the first earth sign. You're the second sign of all of them, which means you're not necessarily the infant, but you're kind of like the toddler. So there's sort of this sort of innocent toddler. Tauruses are known for absolute rights and absolute wrongs. It's kind of another version of Aries. Aries is yes, no, right, wrong, but not necessarily attached to that. Taurus takes a judgment about it because of your safety. For a Taurus and for most earth signs, I like to describe you as like you like your box. You like to know where things are. You feel safe when you know where things are and when you know you have certain amount of control over them. That makes you feel safe. Now, I'm a Pisces with a Sag moon, and the Sag fire people are like, whoa, hold on, don't put me in a box. It's the actual opposite. Like I feel unsafe if I'm in a box. So just right there, looking at the way that you look at the world. So back to your moon sign, which is how you deal with emotion. Your moon sign's in Scorpio, and Scorpios are the second of those three if you will, sections, and it's a water sign, and it's a little more protective, in fact. So Cancer's the first. Cancer's more like, how did you hurt me? Why did you hurt me? Cancer can get victimy, and they get overwhelmed emotionally, but they want to blame it on others. Pisces, where I am, usually takes responsibility for everybody's stuff. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. What did I do? Like, oh my God, I hurt your feelings. I'm so sorry. Like, won't even stand up for themselves necessarily. Scorpio's in the middle. Scorpio has that like, I don't trust you. I don't trust you. I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna pay attention. I'm gonna watch you very carefully because if you can hurt me, and I want to know that you're not gonna hurt me. So I'm gonna stand back and I'm gonna watch until I feel safe to act, to know what your move is gonna be. And then if you betray me, oh, I'm gonna get mad about that and I'm gonna blame you for that because you hurt me. And again, this is all unspoken stuff. So you have I knew there was gonna be water, the what I was looking for in your chart, and it happens your Venus is an Aries. So when it comes to relationships, that is that right, wrong, left, right, black, white, right? Same thing with, let's see, your true nodes in Sag. Oh yeah, we have a shared true node. Your ascendant's in Virgo. So what you're growing into right now is the next stage of the Earth sign, which evolves into doing things the right way, but also the value of education, the value of positivity, the value of learning, right? Virgos are all about learning. Not that we all aren't on some level, but you've got a good balance of stuff. I was looking for the duality. The duality of like I have a client right now, she has a lot of air and a lot of water. And when I look at, and when people who like a lot of Geminis, a lot of air signs, tend to have anxiety. They tend to be very disconnected from their body. Well, hello, because air is about thinking and thoughts and ideation. It's non-physical. It's air. Just think about the element for a second. So if someone is constantly in their head because it's comfortable, then what are they? Disconnected from their body. So when it comes to emotional processing, most of us, just regardless of what your sign is actually, when we start to feel a negative emotion, it hits us in places that we don't understand. And then we go, oh, this isn't comfortable. What is this? Like all of a sudden you get nervous. People have even come to my events and put their hands across their chest, demanding they will not cry. They will not be broken. And I'm like, what's the big deal? Because they're afraid of losing control. So there's this balance of, there's a lot of wanting to be in control, whether it be through understanding or through physical, like knowing where my stuff is or knowing where something is. But then there's this part of you that the phoenix rises from the ashes. Scorpio is the phoenix rising from the ashes. There is a death and rebirth. There's a fascination with death. So when you say, well, I was thinking about death, Scorpio is like the death sign. And that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means there's that dark place. And then can we back up for a second and look at the shadow side? We all, whether we think about it or not, have dark thoughts, dark impulses, dark feelings, because that's the balance of humanity. We're not all light. We're light beings, but we have the ability to go back and forth. That's the contrast. That's what makes us expand. That's what makes us grow. That's what makes us know what to do with this darker side of us, and understanding that our thoughts and these ideas don't have to be actualized, but we also don't have to be afraid of them because there's messages in there for us. There's messages about how to deal with emotions, deal with family members, deal with our life, needs that we have that aren't being met that make us want to rip somebody's head off and shoot them and rip them into pieces. Like we have, when we don't allow ourselves, there was a guy on my show very early on, couple years into the show, and he did a technique about going into like future. It was a kind of a manifestation thing, but he started with people, and I did some work with him. And the technique basically was after you go to the vision of what you want, you go back and you deal with your anger. And he was real big on people having repressed anger and people not allowing themselves to express that anger. It's part of your humanity. And so he wanted me to like really get angry. And I couldn't access it completely the way that he was doing it with me because he got very attached to whether I was doing it right or not. And I was like, hold on, dude, this is my session. Like, you got to let me, process. But I understood I understood the principle of when we allow ourselves to be truthful about the thoughts and feelings that we have and express them in healthy ways. So maybe I want to quote unquote kill somebody. Do you hurt somebody? No. But what can you do that would allow that emotion, that energy to be present for you in a healthy way that honors that it's a feeling that you're having without actually hurting somebody or yourself? How can I express this? But we're told that's not right. Don't do that. That is bad. Repress that back down. Go ahead and get judged for having that instead of, I'm sure that's probably one of the reasons why you're hospitalized, right? Because the minute that we tell somebody we want to take our lives, oh my God, we have to hospitalize her. And I understand why, because they're trying to protect you. But when we don't acknowledge that we are human beings that have the ability to create destruction and death, and these are part of natural instincts that we have, it doesn't mean you act on them, but you educate people on what's going on for me and how do I process this and how do I make sense of this? And then what do I do about it? And let me tell you, repressing it is not the way. But when I medicate you, it's going to repress it for you, which is why the more we repress, the more we ignore, the more we don't understand, the more we're afraid of losing control, the more we're going to stay stuck in this cycle of these symptoms. And that's what I've been seeing. Like I told you before, I had a cousin that was diagnosed as bipolar, which I completely disagreed with because I saw the whole thing, his entire life. I could break it down for you, everybody, not that I'm going to, but I mean, if you want to, you can hire me, then I will tell you. I'm not going to publicly do it because in case any family members are listening, it's not for me to say that, but I can say it privately to people that I watched the entire show and I saw what happened, and I saw the change in belief systems and the change of how do I get love and connection and the self-worth identification. Here's how I identify as being worthy of love and connection and attention. And then when that changes on a dime and all those tricks that you didn't work anymore, your entire paradigm changes. And this topic of breaking free from your psychological diagnosis, I recognized that back then, nobody was going to listen to me. They didn't listen. They still don't listen to me, nor will they ever listen to me. And that's fine. They are the impulse and the contrast to get us having this conversation for all of you who are listening, who might listen. And if you don't, that's fine too. It's not for me to control what you do, but it's to listen to someone who's been through it and someone who's educated and learned and now is past this diagnosis and doesn't have any of these symptoms because of all the things that you learned and all that stuff that you went through really created the impulse for you to say, I'm going to learn this and I'm going to uncover. Because when we sit back, whether it be medical or psychological or whatever, we sit back and we let ourselves be diagnosed by somebody else's inability to recognize the multi-complex systems that goes into our behavior patterns, our traumas, the way we express our emotions or don't, the way we look at the world. It is not as simple as here, boom, boom, boom. Oh, you must have this.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that makes me so frustrated looking back now is now that I understand what I understand, I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, no wonder I was having those symptoms. Like, yes, that is a normal emotional reaction to the trauma that I experienced. And we don't recognize that. We don't recognize these as the way that our brain is coping, the way that our body is coping. When somebody is diagnosed with anxiety disorder, the first thing that should happen should not be medicating them. That is not what the body is. Anxiety is a response to stress. Anxiety is the body, the lower part of your brain taking over and saying, I am not safe for some reason. And there can be an element of your brain is not getting what it needs to function in a healthy way, and that micronutrient insufficiency, that's becoming very common because our food is so depleted. People are not getting the nutrition to their brain that it needs to function in a healthy way. However, a lot of it is also there are other factors that are playing that is making your brain feel unsafe. It is sensing danger, it is going into fight or flight mode, and you're having an anxiety response to it. And instead of medicating and suppressing that emotional response, we need to say, why is your brain acting that way? Let's find out. It's trying to communicate with us. Instead of stopping the communication, we need to ask the question, because what happened for me is my suffering persisted. They put me on psychotropic drugs, which I kept taking, even though I felt terrible on them. I kept trying to explain to people. And one of the things that drives me crazy is when I hear people say, there's two phrases that I hear all the time. One of them is um, the treatment resistant. When I hear people say treatment resistant, what they're actually saying is you are not stopping your symptoms aren't stopping because we're giving you this drug. That's all treatment resistant means. And treatment resistant is a terrible phrase. It's a euphemism for saying our drugs weren't able to stop your symptoms. That's not what should be happening. That you need to ask why they're having the symptoms in the first place. It eliminates the curiosity that we have into the underlying source of symptoms. We think we've been given an explanation. The other thing that I hate is when they'll say somebody is non-compliant. They're not compliant with their treatment. I am totally understand why people go off their meds. Our brains don't feel normal on them. They don't feel right. I didn't feel right for over a decade. And I kept doing it because I was trying to do what the doctors were telling me. And I thought I had this chemical imbalance. And so I was trying to take my insulin, for my chemical imbalance. And I remember at one point I was on 7 different psychotropic drugs. So what happens when the drugs aren't doing their job, when they're not managing it, they start layering medications on top of each other. You're having side effects, so they give you another medication. I was on 2 different antidepressants. I was on a mood stabilizer. I had a few different medications for anxiety because I couldn't tolerate therapeutic doses, is the way they described it. And so they would just layer up the medications. And I told my husband one day, I said, I can't feel anything and I don't feel right. Like, I don't like this. This doesn't feel, I feel like a zombie. And I said, I don't know if this is any better than feeling all the time. Like, it just didn't feel right. And when I finally got off of the medications, it took like 6 months to go through the cross titration process, which is, increasing micronutrients to help your brain heal. And then you very, very slowly withdraw the medication. And I just want to say for your audience, I do not advocate people just going off their meds on their own. You need somebody to help you with that process. The company that I got my micronutrients from helped me through the process. They understand drug action, they understand all of these things. And so they were very knowledgeable and helped me through that process. I had one day about 5 months in where I woke up and felt like I was finally awake for the first time in over a decade. And I called my husband. I was so excited. I'm like, oh my gosh, is this what normal people's brains feel like? Like I didn't remember what it felt like to feel awake. He thought I was manic initially because I was so animated and excited. And I'm like, no, 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 I'm not manic. Like I feel like my brain's working normally for the first time. And it was just the beginning. Like I had so far to go still on the healing process, but we have got to stop. We have got to stop treating people with psychotropic drugs first. I think maybe this is like a tiny caveat. There might be a place for it as a triage type treatment when somebody gets to the point where they are a danger to themselves or others. I think that there is a tiny place for it. Just like when somebody's running a fever of 105, there's danger of brain damage. You'll give them something to bring the fever down initially, but you don't give them that for the rest of their lives. You give it to them temporarily until you can, so that they get back into a safe place, and then you have curiosity. And that's what we need. That's one of the reasons why I loved having you on my show, because you teach curiosity. That's what you teach people. You teach people to be curious about themselves, be curious about your lives. We're going to become detectives in our lives, and we're going to look for these core wounds. We're going to look for the source of these symptoms. Your brain's trying to communicate. Don't shut it down. Let's ask it what it's trying to tell you. Let's be curious about it.
My family member died because of all those drugs. He was drinking also, which I'm sure you're not supposed to do, but he was young, and I don't think it was just because of that. I think there was a bigger reason, more spiritual reason that all of this was supposed to happen. But and maybe part of it was right now. Part of it was this conversation that we're having right now for someone who's listening to this, who's on these drugs, who feels like crap, and who doesn't know any better, and is thinking, I don't really like this anymore. I mean, I know for me, that's who I attract. I want people to know that there are so many more layers to understanding what's going on for you than what the average population understands or knows, in every way, healing from psychological to emotional to spiritual to familial to anything. Everything is healable. But the kinds of things that we're taught that's mainstream, you're not going to hear in your doctor's office. You're not going to hear from your psychologist or psychiatrist who's prescribing you medication. I did a show back in probably the first 2 years of my podcast. And if I haven't mentioned it in the beginning of the intro here, please everybody go look for it. It's on Fit to Love. It's with Jeannie Peters. At the end of season 2, we did a show called, and I stopped doing seasons. I did season 1, season 2, and then I was like, forget it. We're just never doing it. It's just going to keep going for 10 years. It was about the negative effect of those drugs and probiotics. So we looked at gut health and depression, and it might have been under the probiotic one, but we talked about all the damage, because that cycle happens that the minute you start taking these drugs, they wreck your gut and your gut flora and all of your bacteria, which creates your neurotransmitters that go to your brain. So now when you're on all of these drugs, you are out of balance anyway in your gut, and that's going to take forever to restore. So it's like you're not the weighing out like the positive and the negatives. We have to look at like, okay, well, how do I, if it's helping me, then great. Like one size isn't going to fit all. For some of you, I know some people are going to say, you know what, the drugs make me feel better. Great. Then for you, take the drugs. If you as a person feel better with something that you're doing and your life works better and your system works better, then keep doing what you're doing. I'm not here to tell you to stop doing drugs or whatever if they're working for you. But for those of you that are out there that are seeking because you know what you're doing isn't working, it's not a long-term solution. There's something that's gnawing at you in the back of your head that says there has to be a different way. This doesn't feel like healing. This doesn't feel like health. This doesn't feel natural. This feels like I'm adding some foreign thing into my body that I don't need, that I don't make. Why can't I fix what I do naturally within my own body?
Yeah.
So yeah, it got me, I had someone else on the show a couple of years ago. Where's her book? She also overcame her diagnosis of being bipolar. And she did it through a series of some similar mindfulness exercise. I don't know how much nutrition it was, but it was definitely a lot of psychological things and meditation and consciousness work. But she ended up getting a diagnosis that said she no longer was bipolar. And she wrote a book about it, and I had her on the show. And that's been somebody can go listen to that too. But we had a little different connection, or not as, you and I, because of what you're doing in the world with helping people who identify as bipolar disorder or anxiety disorder, depression disorder. Anybody that's coming to your show looking for answers or for help, because your mission is to help them really get better and have other options and not just feel trapped by what your doctor told you to do, which, by the way, they get kickbacks from the pharmaceutical companies, everybody. This is not, your doctor may be a wonderful person who means well, but there are a lot of people out there that do not want to do the work to look under the hood of the car to know how it works. They just want to say, boom, 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 it must be this, here, take this, and you're done, I'm done, it's easy. And that's what I was taught. And I'm not blaming them for being, there's newer souls and older souls, and they're not that interested. They see it like, I'm doing my job. I'm doing what I was told. I was told to do this, and this is how I'm doing it. And then there's the rest of us who are seekers, who are asking questions, and are like, well, why would I do that? Well, what is the negative? Doug's mother takes a million medications, and he, since being with me, now looks at things and started reading the side effects of all her medications and read them to her. And she's like, well, why would the doctor prescribe this to me? And I was like, well, because he probably doesn't know what other options there are for you. And he probably assumes you won't do them, because the majority of people want the pill. They want the easy way out, no matter what it costs them. So,
and my doctor, it's interesting. I told you I had like 8 different doctors. My last doctor he treated me for a long time. He treated me for about 8 years. And after all my hospitalizations, I was still suffering. I was like hanging on by my fingernails. And I ended up bringing to him the information about the micronutrients. because I was scared. Like I wanted to find something, but at that point I had just reconciled myself. Like I'm just going to suffer for the rest of my life, but I'll do it because I love my daughter. And a friend of mine turned me onto this company. It's this nonprofit out of Canada that had developed this micronutrient specifically for people who presented with bipolar disorder symptoms. And I brought it to him, and he looked at the all of the studies that had been done on it. There were like 35 different studies that had been done on it. And he actually looked at the research and he said, it looks like maybe this might be a viable option. And he admitted to me, that was in one visit. The next time I came to see him, he admitted to me, he said, if you had brought that to me even a year ago, I wouldn't have even looked at it. All of their education is focused exclusively on treatment with pharmaceutical drugs, and all of their continuing education is funded by pharmaceutical companies. And the way they are educated, it is like a hazing almost. Like they are overwhelmed and inundated with an excessive amount of information and judged based on how well they regurgitate that information. It is not a situation where they're in there and they're encouraged to question what they're being taught or invited to come up with, do you think this is the right approach? Should we try something different? And in fact, there's a book, my red pill moment was when I read this book called Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker. And he goes through just the history of psychiatry. He goes through, the history of psychotropic drugs and their development and discovery and all that. And he talks about how the way that they approach all of this is so there's no room. People that do try to question it are ostracized. Funding is removed. They are punished for stepping outside of the box. They are punished for stepping outside of the norm of the way that they view it. And that's what happened to me when I first started sharing what I was learning. I was told I was dangerous. I was shadow banned on social media. And all I was trying to do was help people. I don't, if somebody wants to take drugs, that's awesome. I mean, not awesome, but I mean, that's their choice. That's their path. I honor people's agency. I honor their choice to do what they feel is right for them. But I was trying to help the people like me. Just like you were saying, I was trying to help the people that were just suffering. Nothing was working. They weren't getting any better. They were just suffering. 83%, 83% of the people diagnosed and treated with bipolar disorder will become severely disabled by this treatment. And it's the treatment itself, because you are not addressing the underlying source of the symptoms. The source of the symptom is never addressed. It's never identified and addressed. And it's usually multiple sources. So for me, my sources of symptoms were micronutrient insufficiency, trauma, and unhealthy thought and behavior patterns. Those were the things that were causing my symptoms to occur in the first place. And then I ended up with iatrogenic symptoms caused by the psychotropic drugs. So the healing process had to go in reverse. I had to first get the drugs out of my system. And that was a very stressful process. It's really difficult to get these drugs out because it changes your brain chemistry when you take them. And it took time for my brain to heal. And then once my brain was working in a healthy way, that was the only time that I was actually able to address the trauma. One of the difficult things about trying to address trauma when you are on psychotropic drugs is that it is suppressing your emotional response. And so we don't learn it was really hard learning how to deal with normal emotions. It took years for me to recognize when I started to experience depression, like a normal person does. Depression is a normal human state. That's not an abnormal human state. It is not an illness. We got to stop calling it saying when somebody's depressed that they are mentally ill, right? It is anymore. I mean, I guess you could call it an illness in that, you're suffering, just like when somebody's got a fever, they're suffering, but it is not you're not broken. Your brain isn't broken. It's not dysfunctional, right? But that was when I finally started experiencing normal emotional responses. And I had to remind myself, okay, so this bad thing happened in my life. It is normal to feel depressed. This is a normal emotional response to what's happening right now, because I had so many decades of believing that when I was depressed, it was my chemical imbalance, right? And so I had to learn how to process normal emotions. I had to learn how to recognize it's okay to be angry. That's okay. It's just information. My brain's just trying to deliver information. So that's one of the things, when I interviewed you on my podcast, I love talking to you because what you are doing is what I'm trying to encourage people to do in their lives. When we get a medical diagnosis, and when and people come to me all the time, they're like, I am bipolar. I'm like, no, you're not. You're not, do you say I am fever? Of course you don't say that. That would be ridiculous. I am not bipolar. I'm not my symptoms. You have symptoms. I have these things going on. What's going on? Why are you having those symptoms? Why is your brain reacting that way? I think one of the challenges, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this from the experience you have with people, but I think one of the challenges is that these symptoms are scary to us. When you have compulsive behaviors that cause you to do things that are really bad for you or bad for other people, it feels scary and you feel out of control and you want it. It feels good to have somebody say, it's not your fault. It's this disorder that you have. It doesn't feel good, however, to stay in that place. Like that doesn't feel good, but we don't know that there's any alternative. And it is so liberating. It was like extraordinarily liberating to be able to take responsibility for myself, to actually be able to say, okay, yes, I'm having these symptoms, but I can do something about it. It was so helpful to start understanding like my brain just isn't getting what it needs to function in a healthy way, number one. So once I give my brain what it needs, like if our bodies aren't getting what they need to function in a healthy way, you get sick. Doesn't feel good. You don't want to stay that way, right? We gotta give our bodies what they need to function in a healthy way, the same as our brains. And then when I started learning how to utilize, I'm with you. I'm not a fan of talk therapy, but
So
utilize
you did
trauma
it for
processing.
12 years and thought it wasn't worth
Yeah,
it.
well, it wasn't doing any good. Just talking about the problems wasn't helping. But when I started learning how to be proactive about utilizing trauma processing, identifying unhealed trauma and then processing it, actually letting myself go through the normal emotional, process of dealing with the trauma and healing. I mean, it was extraordinary. I remember the biggest trauma that I processed was I was abused in my first marriage, pretty severely sexually and emotionally and mentally abused. And I hid that. Like I buried it deep. And when I finally got the courage to deal with it, and I finally found somebody that was effective in helping me deal with it, it was pretty hellish going through the process because, I had to kind of relive a lot of what I had experienced. But once it was over, I was like, oh my gosh, why did I wait 30 years to do that? Like it was all these things, all these like behaviors that I kept trying to fix were gone because the underlying source was gone. The underlying issue was gone. And a lot of times people spend their entire lives trying to deal with the consequences of the issue. And it is impossible. Like all of the compulsive behaviors that had developed as a coping mechanism for this underlying trauma, I kept trying to fix them. I was going to groups and therapy and all this stuff trying to fix these issues. And all the while, the underlying source was not being addressed. And until that was addressed, these things persisted. And it was like, it was just an exercise in insanity, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I love what you do. And I just want to, I would love to hear from you. Like, if you've experienced that with people, if people come in with this idea, like, I've got this illness and I don't have any control over it and I'm kind of a victim to it. Like, have you seen that shift in them with your own experience with people as they start to recognize, like, oh, there's a reason for this and there's something I can actually do about it?
Yeah, I have, they're the people that identify with and are sometimes unwilling to let go of that diagnosis because other people around them, like if they were to say, I don't believe that, other people around them would feel nervous
Hmm.
or scared for them, right? So it's really hard for some people to say, well, I agree, I'm probably fine. There's this understanding that when we have trauma and we don't know how to do it, and then let's go back to sort of my astrological your elements. Think about the elements for a second and the ability of an element and what its strengths and weaknesses are. So we have air, earth, water, and fire. Fire is about movement, energy. Okay. Water is emotion. Okay. So flowing, flowy, you can't you can contain it, but you're not going to stop it from moving in this flowy kind of way. Air, which is sort of dispersed and all over the place, and then earth, you're solid. Earth people normally are very dedicated, very hardworking, very loyal, and very freaking stubborn because it takes a lot to move something that doesn't move, something that doesn't change. Yes. So when we look at the elements and we say, what are my energetic dispositions of and habits and patterns and things that feel safe for me and things that feel natural to me. The problem that I see with a lot of people who want to claim these diagnoses is that they, depending on their sign, depending on their upbringing, obviously all the things, depending on their wounds, is that it does give them a bit of relief to feel like it's explainable, but it
Yeah.
also lets you off the hook for dealing with it. And when
Yeah.
you don't deal with it, so how I help people deal with it. So let's talk about, so those of you that are in the community, end of the year is coming. The programs are starting in January. There's 3 of them, but I'm going to talk about one in particular right now. Well, I'll talk about 2. The rewiring your core wound patterns. Let's talk about rewiring core wound patterns. So until you understand the trauma, and I'd even say, Michelle, your core wounds predate your trauma, right?
Yeah.
Because I have another friend who I did some work with on her show. We did it live. It did not work. I'm like, you need to fill out the form. I can't, you have to see, because she couldn't remember. Her trauma made her forget all of the things about her parents. It colored, because both of her parents had died by the time she was 25. And that was very traumatic for her. So she almost won't let herself remember anything negative about an experience that she had with her parents. And I'm like, okay, your trauma is your trauma, but there were wounds before the trauma
Yeah.
that were from 0 to 7 that created this relationship. And now you've kind of put a little bit of a box on that. And now we're not looking at it. And because there's trauma, and now the trauma has created this coping mechanism, and behavior and belief system. So I'm going to go
Yeah.
back to the beliefs. The important thing about the wounds is understanding how the wounds created your belief about yourself and the world. And the only 2 things, this comes from Dr. Bruce Lipton, epigenetics, looking at healing in all ways. There are only 2 beliefs that we have to have in order for our bodies to heal. Now, getting those 2 things healed is like, they're going to sound real simple, and they are, but how do I actually live that is everything in between. Everything in between where you are now and all the wounds and all of the beliefs that you have about who you are in the world and who am I to say that, and if I say this, someone's going to reject me and they're going to leave me and I'm not going to get love, or I'm going to be hurt or ostracized or whatever. I'm abandoned. And it's the 2 beliefs are that I am safe physically, emotionally, spiritually. I am safe all the time, every day, no matter what. Until you're not, of course, in a situation where you're being chased. Okay, in that moment, you're not safe and you do what you have to. But generally, I am safe. And then also, I love myself. And those 2 things, I mean, you and I talked about on your show, the performing for love
Yeah.
aspect, right? Which we all learn. I mean, God, I did the other day with our neighbor and her 2-year-old daughter. I love her. And she blew out her candles. And I'm like, oh my God, look at what I'm doing. I'm literally giving her love and attention for blowing out her candles. I'm like, we are trained at an early age to perform for love. If I do this, everybody gets happy. If I, you know, oh, it's so, and I would love to find a way around it. And hopefully I will at some point. But this is what we start to learn, but we don't ask those questions. We do what you said. We're medicating, and then we're trying to deal with the top level behaviors. But the root of all of it is the wound that you have and the way you look at the world and the belief that you have. I did a show called Overcoming Depression way early on in Spirit, Purpose, and Energy. Everybody can go back and listen to that. And we identify 3 different kinds of depression. And everyone thinks they have chemical, but the least, like literally, most people don't have chemical until you're diagnosed and then you get on drugs. Then you have chemical. But before that, it wasn't chemical, it was
Yeah.
situational. It was situational, or it was repression. Repression of your emotional energy leads to depression because you're literally holding down the life force that wants to come out of you. You are spending all of your energy forcing it down and making it stay there when all it wants to do is come out. That's what anxiety is. Anxiety is holding back emotion that wants to be expressed because you don't feel safe to express it, because you don't know what to do with it, because for many reasons why people are terrible at processing emotion, and no one's taught you and no one's a good example. So, and your parents, God forbid you cry, that activates their sadness and trauma. So, oh no, don't cry, don't cry. And then they calm you down. And then you're told, then your belief is, oh, it's not safe to cry, can't cry. That affects people badly. So let me repress even more. So we wonder why we're in this shitstorm of I don't know what to do with my emotions, is because no one teaches you about them. And I guess I came into this life, and that is what always has been interesting to me. And that's sort of my zone of genius, I think, is processing emotions and understanding them, being an observer and being able to see them, and then giving you the understanding and the tools to work through them. So if you are listening to this episode, whether it be you or someone you know or love, and you are struggling with a diagnosis or not, even if you just think you're depressed or you have anxiety, those are enough. And which, by the way, in some of the things that you were sharing, Michelle, what I heard was we want to label things Depression's a label, right? We want to
Yeah.
label it, but really I heard that you were sad.
Yeah.
I heard that you were sad. Depression is a judgment about the sadness. Oh, I'm sad too long. Like I'm being sad too long. I must be depressed. Well, depressed is also just repression and repression of whatever energy is wanting to come out of you. And I'm sure there was a lot of anger. Scorpio has a lot of it's a water sign, but there's a lot of fire. There's a lot of active possible anger out of Scorpios because of when you're hurt, the thing you want to do is hurt back. So, hello, where does the dark energy come from? Where does the thoughts of, the negative thoughts? And then of course, then you go, oh, I shouldn't want to harm somebody else, so let me harm myself. Like it has to go somewhere. And we don't have any idea. So go back to the original question. If somebody's coming to me and they feel safe to heal, or safe to at least heal quietly, regardless of what the family around them thinks. We look at places where they haven't, just normal behaviors of, again, I go to Geminis. Geminis are the first air sign, and Geminis are considered two-faced or, because, or what's another one? Maybe they would be bipolar or multiple personality disorder because they have different, that's the thing. Gemini doesn't know whether to be Aries or Taurus. It's the third of the signs. It goes Aries, Taurus, Gemini. Gemini is literally two because it has two choices before it and doesn't know which one to be, although it has its own elements. Right. And so how that expresses, people might think, well, you're nuts. One time you're like this, another time you're like this. Right. It's because they're a Gemini. It's not because they're nuts. It's because they're, so I think that there are other softer, different elements that come into play when we make sense of psychological behaviors. And we still have to go back to the belief of what do you believe that creates a situation in which you act or do or say or feel this way. And if we don't go back to the beliefs and you're trying to control feelings, if you're trying to deal with emotions without changing the belief, without understanding the belief, without identifying the belief, then we're not helping anything because you still have the belief. The belief is the root. The belief is the way you see the world. The belief is the way that you interpret. So anytime stimulus happens, those emotions are going to get triggered again. So we're trying to control emotions without asking about the belief. It's freaking insane that half of the psychological world is insane as far as I'm concerned, because we're not asking these questions, right? This is mechanics. These are mechanics of emotion. How do I feel? I asked myself, I went to classes about money and they taught it in there and I'm like, oh, well, this makes sense. And I went to classes on emotion. I'm like, yeah, let's just break down what an emotion is. Emotion is a interpretation. First, there's the thought or a memory or an observation. And then from there, based on your belief, there's an interpretation. And that's why half the world can look at one thing and be horrified, and the other half can be happy about the same thing we're looking at, is because we have different filters of interpretation. Yeah. And so, yeah, I really just appreciate you sharing your story with everybody today. I know you do it on your show, and I know you've done it, I'm sure, before. So it's not like I've asked you to pull yourself out of, being hidden away and share and share your openness and all the things with other people, because you are on a mission to do this for people. And I really value that. And I want everybody to also make sure that you follow Michelle's show. Please send this episode to anybody who is struggling with a diagnosis. However, before you send it, ask them, are you looking to feel better, do better, heal differently, or for a different solution? Don't just send it to somebody who is happy taking the drugs or feels like, oh no, I'm good, because then they might be offended by this entire conversation. And so please ask first, because I have a quote. It's called, if they're not asking, they're not listening. But you can ask. You can say, hey, I just listened to this great show about someone who overcame the diagnosis of bipolar. Also, you overcame all of them. So that would be anxiety and depression and, right? Like, that's a lot of diagnoses that you overcame. And you can say, if you're interested in changing that, listen to the show, and then also follow Michelle. Go listen to the Upside of Bipolar, because I'm sure she talks about this more than I do, because that's the name of her show. Like, she's giving you tools about that all the time. What else do you offer, Michelle, before I kick them into my program?
Absolutely. The first thing that I would encourage people to do is go check out that free resource that I offer. The Mood Cycle Survival Guide is free for everybody. Anybody can use it. It's really a powerful resource. And if that's all somebody takes away from this, I think they'll be better off for it. So I would encourage them to go on my website. It's under free on the website. And then I have a podcast. I've got a blog. I have a book that I just published. It was a #1 international bestseller, The Upside of Bipolar, 7 Steps to Heal Your Disorder. And that shares my story. I'm an open book. Like, I've shared, my entire journey. and the steps that I took to heal that are things that other people can utilize and apply in their own lives.
Beautiful. And I would say go do all of that and apply for the rewire. There are 2 spots left for rewiring your core wound patterns. I will give you all of this information. You will know exactly what your beliefs are, what your triggers are, what your traumas are, how they affect your life, how you see the world in 6 months. Will it be healed in 6 months? No. But will you be very changed in 6 months? 100%. And you will also come away feeling like you can handle anything because you understand the mechanics. The core wound map will show you, and it will always show you. You will have literally a piece of paper that has all the data on it from about your core wounds, how you react, how you compensate, what you believe, how you keep them alive every day in your own life, which doesn't get them any better, the things that you need to change right away, and the things that proactively you have to do to stretch out of your comfort zone to rewire the brain to have a new belief system. We need to replace that belief system with a new one. You'll get all of that in 6 months. All right. So please, jjflizanes.com/apply. There are 2 spots left. And I would love to make sure somebody who really, 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 really needs this work and wants 2025 and beyond to be so much different than everything that's led up into this. However, everything that you've gone through has led you to here. So it's appreciating this journey, no matter how rocky, no matter how ridiculous, no matter how, no judgments, no matter how hard it's been. Obviously, Michelle, you had to get to the place where you had that thought about your daughter, and then thank God. But even all the things, like, you couldn't even have the credibility to help the people now without all of that stuff, right?
Absolutely.
Right. I believe everything is on purpose. But when you have a clear sign that it's time to grow, it's time to move on, it's time to feel freer, it's time to heal, it's time to do something different, don't ignore it. If you ignore it, you maintain keeping up whatever is bothering you. You keep whatever dysfunction's happening dysfunctional. So please, please love yourself enough, or somebody else, to suggest that they take action, they invest in themselves for 2025, and they, for once in their, probably in a long time, feel free and hopeful. Because I promise that is what you're going to feel. If nothing else, you will feel hopeful and you will feel free, because you have so much information about what is going on inside of you and how you work, that you're going to feel a sense of confidence, purpose, strength, and calm and peace that you maybe have never felt before in your life. So please do all the things. Follow Michelle, get her download, buy her book, listen to her show, and apply and see if it's a fit, and get your butt in the rewiring your core wound patterns for 2025. Thanks, Michelle.
Absolutely. Thank you.